Perspective. One way of thinking about perspective is, well, how you look at things and how what you see can change depending on what you're focusing on. For example, there's a classic picture that, depending on your perspective, you see either an old woman or a young woman, and it's the same picture. Nothing's changed there except how you're looking at it. The point? Well, perspective matters. See, what you focus on influences what you see. And what you see influences the feelings that you have and the actions that you take. For example, you might feel or act differently depending if you're looking and focusing on the little details or the big picture. Perspective's important, but learning perspective, especially what I'll call a big picture perspective, is not particularly easy. In fact, it's especially tricky when you're in the middle of a pain point. Here's kind of a silly example of that. When I was out helping my son recover from his ACL surgery this year, I was moving one way and he asked for something, and I turned quickly around and slammed my toe into the corner of the table, and off came part of the nail on the big toe. And that was like, ouch! And in that moment, I was not thinking, oh, well, it's not such a big deal, not life-threatening or anything. What I was thinking was like, oh, that really hurts. And I was thinking some pretty unchurchy words. And I also started thinking about, well, how am I going to help him if I've really messed things up and I'm hobbling around too and I have to go to the doctor, and how am I going to help him get his big dog out on all his walks? And that was an immediate short-term perspective. Long-term perspective was, well, yeah, it hurts, but I'm looking at it and I can figure out how to keep going without going to the doctor, and it'll all work out. Now, it was kind of easy to do that because I could actually see what the issue was, and I could see the damage and knew it probably wouldn't delay me that long. It's much harder to have that long-term perspective, that big picture perspective, when you can't see an end to the stress or the strain or the struggle or the pain. But getting that big picture perspective is also necessary. Very, very necessary. So here's the big question today as we're wrapping up this look at Joseph's story. How do you develop this big picture, long-term perspective that'll help you get through those pain moments, that hard, pressing, and immediate pain stuff that you're dealing with? That's what we'll get into as we're wrapping up our look at Joseph's story. Genesis chapter 50.
Joseph's brothers realized what their father's death can mean. So they thought, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us? What if he decides to pay us back for all the evil we did to him? They sent a messenger to Joseph to say, before your father died, he commanded us. This is what you should say to Joseph. I'm begging you to forgive the crime and the sin your brothers committed against you. What they did to you was very evil. So now please forgive our crime, because we are servants of your father's God. Joseph cried when he got their message. Then his brothers also came and immediately bowed down in front of him. We're your slaves, they said. Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. I can't take God's place. Even though you planned evil against me, God planned good to come out of it. This was to keep many people alive, as he is doing now. Don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. In this way, he reassured them, setting their minds at ease.
So here's the situation. The brothers and their family and their father have been living in Egypt for 17 years now. And Joseph had treated them well. And there had been absolutely no signs that Joseph was still nursing a grudge or looking to get revenge or looking at the right time to get him back. But the brothers' perspective is, well, maybe he is, because that's how they would have operated. And though they'd experienced grace and mercy and unconditional forgiveness, and though nothing that Joseph had done in those 17 years would cause them to think that something more sinister is at work behind the scenes, still, what I'll call natural law has a strong grip on their thinking. And I think they're thinking that even after all those years of evidence to the contrary, that revenge still might be in play. Perhaps because they're thinking of their own experience. Now, see, they didn't touch Joseph while Dad was close and around, but the minute that Dad was out of the picture, well, they made their move quickly, and they got rid of Joseph. And perhaps they projected that onto Joseph here. Well, he talks a good game, and so far he's backed it up, and he really hasn't done anything to us yet, but now Dad's gone. And if we were in Joseph's shoes, that's when we'd make our move. And so, well, they're afraid. They're afraid, and so they make up a story to cover themselves. And I think that's because the guilt over their own past bad behavior is still plaguing them, and they're still stuck with that perspective that fairness and retribution and this for that is how the world works, even after all this time. They still have a lot to learn about grace, as do we, I think. As do we. While fairness and retribution and this for that is, in fact, the way the world works, that's not how God operates. At the heart of God's heart is grace. Grace and mercy and love. See, the Bible tells you that Jesus died to forgive you before you did anything to make up for the wrong that you'd done. And that when God forgives your sins, God wipes even the memory of it from the away. That even the memory of the mistakes are gone as if they hadn't even happened. Now, you need to see things from that perspective, that grace perspective, if the grip of your past and the guilt that you feel because of it is going to lose its hold on you. Now, Joseph's brothers, well, they're not there yet. And it's going to take one more grace move from Joseph to get them there, which is what this last scene in Joseph's story, Genesis 50, is really all about. One more grace move so that the brothers truly feel okay. And maybe you find yourself in the same place that the brothers are here, wanting to feel forgiven, but stuck with the lingering feeling that when the time is right, your past is going to come back to haunt you. Well, if you're struggling with fear and guilt like Joseph's brothers were, well, having a grace perspective, that's what helps you let go of your past and get rid of the guilt and the fear too. And know that because of Jesus, you really are okay.
What if I told you you will be okay? That there's nothing in your past that can't be forgiven. Nothing you've done, no matter how hurtful or shameful, can stop the power of God's grace. No matter the road you've walked, the places you've been, or the things you've seen. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and righteous to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So today, no matter what you're dealing with, no matter what burdens are weighing you down, know this: you will be okay.
a grace perspective. What I did wasn't okay, but because of what Jesus did for me on the cross, I'm okay now. We all need that, don't we? And that's not all that a grace perspective does. A grace perspective also helps you get rid of the hold that the past pain done to you by others might still be having on you. I mean, check out Joseph's response to his brother's request. Let me read it to you again, verse 19. Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. I can't take God's place. Even though you planned evil against me, God planned good to come out of it. This was to keep many people alive, as he is now doing now. Don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." In this way, he reassured them, setting their minds at ease. Notice that in his response to his brothers, Joseph nowhere says, "I forgive you," like his brothers requested there. Why? Well, I think it's because from Joseph's perspective, he doesn't have to, because he's already forgiven them. He's already forgiven them, and he's shown for the past 17 years that he's let go and that he's moved on. The past is just water over the dam or water under the bridge that's moved downstream, and he's not going to try to bring that back again. God's been working in Joseph's heart all those years to replace that need for fairness and retribution with grace and with mercy. So stop being afraid, Joseph says, because my perspective has changed. You don't need to fear retribution anymore, because God's been working in me. And now I have God's view of things now. I didn't always, but now I do. So don't be afraid. Grace and mercy have won out. That's a perspective that really changed things too, as far as their relationship was concerned. Because the narrator ends up saying after this, again, in this way he reassured them, setting their minds at ease. Setting their minds at ease. Grace has that sort of an effect. That's what makes a grace perspective so important. But there's a third part of perspective that's also really important to see here as we wrap up Joseph's story. And that's going to help us make sense of stuff when we're going through it or looking back at the stuff that we've gone through. And that's seeing the bigger picture. Okay, seeing the bigger picture. Not just the little details like those individual trees, but the whole forest. And here's why that's important. As long as you're just looking at that one individual tree, seeing only the little details, all you're going to see is the pain there. And you're never going to be able to move past the pain, and no one else will either. And you'll never be able to have hope that something better is not only possible, but that it's coming. Now, reading through Joseph's story, I think it took him a while to get there. Joseph's been through some really tough stuff, and I think for a while there was probably a lot of why and why me and how come and where are you, God? But somehow through it all, God was still working behind the scenes. And God was still working so that Joseph's pain and doubts and fears would never chase God away from Joseph. And in the end of Joseph's story, Joseph is finally able to see that. Joseph now sees what he hadn't seen before, that even in the bad, that God was working. And that though God didn't send the bad, God was still there in the bad, working to help Joseph make it through and working to bring about a good end. Not just for Joseph, but for a whole lot of other people. Genesis 50, verse 20 again. Even though you planned evil against me, God planned good to come out of it. This was to keep many people alive, as he is doing now. Big picture perspective. Through all of Joseph's story, both God's grace and God's providence were at work. Both God's grace and providence were at work to flip the good and the bad and even the ugly around to bring a better end. And not just for Joseph, but for a whole lot of people, even for people who weren't believers in the one true God. I've lived long enough to see that many times in the life of our church, in my own life. Have you seen that too? If you have, then you know that that's sort of a big picture perspective, that behind it all that God is still working, that big picture perspective can give you hope that even if you're in one of those rough spots right now, and you wonder how things can turn out for good, or when they will, or if they even can, you can know that still God's working, and that still God is working for good. The past 4 years have been pretty challenging. Pretty challenging for our family, pretty challenging for our church on a number of levels. And while I don't see yet how everything's going to be resolved, I have seen enough to be able to see some of the good that God's already been working in those past 4 years. Good like working to develop a deeper humility in me and a deeper dependence and reliance on God. Good like our church having to trust in God's direction and provision instead of just coasting on the success of our business plan, which is nowhere near as successful as it was prior to COVID. Good like our entire church through this devoting itself to prayer. Good like God working to bring his message out to people who might never come into a church building through a variety of things, including things like this online message, which, while the trends were there that we needed to do something like this, we probably wouldn't have been doing it except for that push of COVID. That's some of the good that I'm able to see, even though things are still really tough. And I have a feeling that there's even more good that God's working and will be working both in me, in our family, in our church, in the days and the years ahead that eventually we will be seeing. Why am I so confident of that? Perspective. Big picture perspective. Big picture perspective that tells us that what the Bible says about God is true. That Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, which means that God's still working just as he has in the past, and that God's still working to bring about good just as he has in the past, and that even in the tough and the challenging times like these, God did it before, and he can do it again. I mean, these are still tough times for our church right now. And we're facing, for us, what are kind of unprecedented challenges. And perhaps it's the same for you in your personal life right now. Well, perspective helps you deal with the present, even if the present doesn't appear to be very good. And perspective helps you survive the pain when you're right in the middle of it. And perspective gives you hope that the pain that you're in is not all that there is. See, perspective helps you see that in everything, even through the stress and the strain and the struggle, that in everything God's still working. And God's still working to bring about good. Now how do you get that sort of perspective? What helps you move toward a big picture perspective? Well, to get there, ask yourself these 3 questions. Question number 1, what does God say? What does God say? I mean, the narrator in the Joseph stories keeps telling us the Lord was with Joseph. Right? He kept telling us that so that we heard that. And that's one of the reasons to keep reading Bible. Right? To keep reading Bible, to hear God say those same sort of things to you. To hear God say that when times are tough or the situation is challenging or stressful and you're struggling to hold on and to have hope, to get a fresh new perspective from what you hear God say of what's actually possible. That's question number 1. What does God say? Question number 2, what did God do? Again, how many times did God rescue Joseph? How many times did he keep him safe? Did he protect and preserve his life? Did he bring good even when he was experiencing mostly bad, and bring better good in the end than anyone could have seen coming? I mean, that's one reason that we keep getting together with others in church and in groups. It's to talk Bible and to share stories of how God's been working and to remember what God has done. Remembering what God has done gives us that kind of big picture perspective again that we need to make it through tough and stressful and challenging times and situations. And then question number 3, what can God do? What can God do? Well, the Bible tells us he can do more than we can ask or imagine. The Bible tells us, and his track record shows us, that he can do even the impossible. So when you think about what can do, you can think about this. You don't know the when of when the good will come, but you do know the who. You know who holds your present and your future in his hands. And then you trust that his word is true and that his love is unfailing and that his ability to turn bad into good is the same as it's always been. I mean, that's a big picture perspective. And that big picture perspective gives you hope. It gives you hope that God can still do the same sorts of things in our lives too, and hope that what you see is never all that is at work. What you see is never all that's at work. Because in everything and through everything, even the hard and the challenging stuff, even the bad stuff, in all of those things, God is working. And God is working toward good even when we don't see or sense or feel or understand. And God is always working in us to produce the sort of change and the sort of character that needs to be there. And it's going to help us grow in faith and help us be more like him. And sometimes, big picture reminds us that it's through the struggles and the trials and the pressure and the pain that sort of needed change is brought about. I mean, there's all sorts of examples in nature about that. How are diamonds made? Pressure. Gold and silver, it's not worn till it's refined. Weight training makes you stronger, but there's resistance and pain involved with that. Paul put it this way, Romans chapter 5, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance, and endurance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. And he says in Romans chapter 8, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. In all things, God works for the good of those who love him. Isn't that the perspective that looking at Joseph's entire story gives us?